Okay, so we're here again for our next dog ear feature, and we are thrilled to have Andrew McMillan, the wonderful poet, with us this evening. And just to give you a little bit of background on Andrew, he was born near Barnsley in South Yorkshire and studied at the University of Lancaster and then University College in London. And he is now the senior lecturer in creative writing at Manchester Metropolitan University. His debut collection, Physical, which is brilliant, by the way, was published by Jonathan Cape in 2015. And it was the first collection of poems to win the Guardian First Book Award and also the Somerset Maugham Award and the Fenton Oldberg First Collection Prize. His second collection, Playtime, was published by Jonathan Cape in 2018 and won the inaugural Polari Prize. Andrew, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. As a startup journal, it's wonderful to speak to established names such as yourself.
Oh no, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great stuff. I want to start off with a question that I've always wanted to ask you, being a fan of your work. You're a very brave poet, and is there anywhere that you're not prepared to go?
That's a good. I think there should be, shouldn't there? And but there's not. And in fact, the third book that's coming out in a couple of months is even more kind of exposing and kind of quite raw. And it seems to me that, I guess, like with Physical, once I decided that was not decided that was the subject, but once it emerged that poems like Urination and things like that were going to be the subject, it seems to me that you have to kind of lean fully into that then. Otherwise, I think there's those films where someone will be kind of smoking a cigarette. No, so a couple will be about to have sex, and then it'll cut to a curtain blowing in the wind, and then it'll cut back to them, and they'll be having a cigarette afterwards. And you think, well, you've kind of missed out the interesting part of that scene to a certain extent. And I think that once you want to write about the body or write about those kind of intimate moments, any attempt to look away from it or any attempt to kind of flinch becomes to feel euphemistic, or it becomes to feel like avoidance. And so I think really the only way to do it is to kind of lean into it and then worry about it later. Like, I think oftentimes what I find myself saying in workshops or to students is that I think we censor ourselves too early by imagining a kind of readership before we've even written the poem. So we think, oh, I can't write that because such and such will read it, and I can't write that because of X or Y. Whereas I feel like writing it and then worrying about it later is potentially the right thing to do. And I was always comfortable with the fact that certainly in those first two books, I'm kind of only exposing myself, sometimes literally. And so I'm the kind of person that comes off worse. I'm not throwing anyone else under the bus in that sense. This third book has more of other people's lives in it, but they've read the poems and they've edited them for me, and they've kind of had final say over what is said or not. And I think that's important as well if we think about what we're entitled to say or not. And so I guess to go back to that initial question, there are things that I would say, but I have allowed other people to stop me saying, which I think is important because it's no longer just about me. And as the work has grown, it has a readership, and you don't want to expose anyone to something that they're not comfortable with, I think.
Right, that's interesting because you definitely commit in your work. And I guess my follow-up question to that would be, as you're writing this stuff, do you find it hard to self-censor, or are you in a, because you are renowned and well known now, and obviously people are fans of your work, do you find it easier in that sense to just tackle the subject before you tackle your own self-censorship, I guess?
I think in many ways it's, with the first book it was easier because I genuinely never thought that anyone would either publish it or read it. And so there's a kind of sense in which I am only writing these for myself. I think with the second book, because of the kind of look at of everything that happened with that first book, I knew that it would have, whether people liked it or not, it would have an audience that would come to it because they'd read the first one and go, oh, well, I'll give that one a try. And so in many ways, that does feel slightly more exposing, or I think that did make me slightly more nervous because you think, people are, there is going to be an audience that's going to read it, and you never really know that before you put that first book out into the world. I think I Caroline Bird talks really well about this, the great poet Caroline Bird, about kind of sitting in the discomfort, and when we kind of feel that we want to run away from the poem, that's where the kind of good stuff is, and just sitting in it for longer than we think we should. And I mean, I did realize with Playtime, with the second book, because it's so much about kind of adolescence and early kind of sexual awakening and things like that, I realized after I'd written it that I hadn't been a very nice person to be around as I was writing it, because I think just re-inhabiting those moments and having to sit in them and be uncomfortable in them to be able to write the poems had kind of obviously brought a lot of stuff back up to the surface that maybe I thought wasn't there. And so in that sense, I think it made me quite not a very nice person to be around or to live with. But I never have problems going there, I don't think. And I think that, I mean, I guess the broader thing about that sort of work that we might call confessional, or that begins in the self, is that you just always have to have an eye on kind of why you're telling it to someone. Like, I'm not an egomaniac. I don't think anything that's ever happened in my life is interesting, really. I don't think anyone else should care. It's like dreams, right? Isn't it? When someone walks into a room and says, I just had this amazing dream last night, and you just go, oh God. Because dreams are only ever interesting to the person that had them. Because there's something about the kind of subconscious world of that dream that only makes sense to the person that was there in the dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm kind of saying something about my life or exposing myself, I think the thing that helps me is to think that it's not that particular thing that's interesting. It's what is behind it, or what it could open a window into. In the same way that if I was a poet of landscape and I showed you a tree, it's not because that tree is particularly interesting. It's because that tree says something about a wider thing or a bigger idea of something. And I think it's the same if we're exposing ourselves, or we're writing stuff that begins in the self. It's not because that's the most interesting thing. It's because that is an experience that could maybe sort of stand in for something else. And in that sense, I view it almost like stand-up comedy, in that it's particularly, I mean, with both those books, there's an odd disjuncture between myself, who's very shy and very anxious and very private, and the self that writes those books, or the self that gets on stage and kind of tells people things that I would never tell my closest friends. And so it helps to think of it as a kind of slightly heightened performative version of the self, I think.
That sort of correlation that you've drawn between the poet and the stand-up comedian is quite interesting. They're both on the outside looking in. Comedy is something that I'm particularly interested in. Do you think there's an element of risk to that bravery and honesty that you're talking about?
I mean, the risk is, stand-up comedy I'm fascinated by, because there's that great podcast called Comedian's Comedian, where they talk about the craft of how they write jokes. I'm just kind of fascinated by, because it strikes me it's a great podcast, because for any artist, because it's really about how one constructs language, and then how one controls an audience, it seems to me. And there's something about, I mean, I guess two things. One is that the risk is that nobody meets you there when you say it. And so when I wrote, I'm scared of bumping someone while they piss in urination, the kind of danger is that everyone goes, oh, that's a unique thing to you, Andrew. And then what happened with that poem was that obviously everyone else goes, oh yeah, me too. And it turns out you can kind of have a conversation with men about how uncomfortable they are in those kind of spaces. So I think there's
relatable.
It's relatable in that sense. And I think there's a risk that the risk of it is that nobody meets you there, or that they feel that it's too much. And there'll always be people that don't like that style of poetry, and that's fine. It's not everyone's kind of cup of tea. I mean, I think the other thing is, I think with both books, but particularly the second one's much more about kind of self-intimacy and intimacy with the self. And I had to really think hard about how I would perform that from that book, or read from that book at festivals or at gigs and readings, because who wants to sit in a front row and listen to somebody read a kind of sequence of masturbation poems kind of directly at them for 20 minutes? Like, I don't want to be in that audience. Maybe those poems have to be enjoyed on your own at home and things like that. And I think that the other thing about kind of comedy is that notion of how you inflate and deflate tension in a room. And so when the audience needs that little prick of release, which is maybe a kind of little amusing anecdote that finishes off a poem or introduces a poem, and I've always kind of liked doing that as well. But I guess the risk, as I say, is in the risk is either that people don't meet you halfway and that you're kind of left out on a limb, or that it just kind of doesn't resonate or land with people. I think that that's not a kind of universal risk. Some people will always feel that my work doesn't kind of land with them, that it doesn't speak to them, that it's too kind of exposing, that it's too kind of raw and things like that. And I think that you know, that's fine. And I guess that's the only risk of it. But work, I think, finds its own audience or finds its own little niche to kind of occupy, I guess.
Okay, so if I could follow up then, we're talking about where how poetry lands with a prospective audience. What would you say constitutes success?
There are two so my comfort zone, which I learned from my dad, right? And so kind of growing up, is that I feel comfortable on stage if I can make people laugh, which is then inherently in tension with the work, because the work's not meant to be funny. And so my kind of comfort zone is that I can do a kind of witty introduction or a kind of humorous introduction to something, and then kind of going to read the serious poem. I think that the measure of success with a live audience is that you can kind of feel, and this is why Zoom readings I think are harder. You can feel the kind of reaction from the audience, and it's not that they may be laughing out loud or they kind of make that odd kind of poetry afterwards. They may be not doing that, but you can sort of feel that you've held them, or you can feel that language has made some sort of impact on them. And I mean, the odd way that I can always measure that is that after readings, people will come up to me and tell me very strange things about their private life, or about their partners, or about their kind of sex life and things like that, in a way that they feel somehow the work has opened this door into a kind of intimacy that they feel they have with me, which they would never feel if I was just sat next to them in the bus stop. So somehow that work opens that door that they feel they have permission to kind of say stuff like that to me. I think in a broader sense, I think success as a poet is literally when someone who isn't one of your close friends reads your work. And so when strangers start to tell you that they kind of enjoyed your work, that's when I felt like the books had been successful, not the awards or anything like that, but when people who I'd never met had found them and had felt some sort of connection to them, I guess.
I was interested earlier in the interview when you said that you described it as luck with the first book. But for me, going back to a few things that we've already covered, I think it's the relatability of your work, which is inevitably why it's successful. Because we've all been in these positions in the gym hall when we've had that kind of awkward sexual awakening as a 14, 15-year-old, whether it be brushing past somebody at a urinal. Many of the kind of situational and observational things that you write about are very relatable in everyday life. And it might just be that we have to read it in one of your books to realize that.
I think so. I mean, that's what I hope. And I mean, I always wanted to, I mean, it's interesting because Physical came out in 2015, and I'd really taken my cue from a kind of younger generation of queer American poets who had come up kind of in the few years before that, and who I'd really been reading and studying, and you know, older poets like Mark Doty and Sharon Olds and people like that. And so in a sense, if the work felt slightly fresh or newer over here, it was because it kind of lent partly on that American voice, which had been developing over the kind of in the previous years. But also, I mean, I always trying to say to my students, like, I think that the most interesting work, or the work that kind of arrives and feels new or feels different, is when really different influences have kind of been put into a blender and kind of spun together and then come out in a way that could only be you. And so for me, it was like these American voices. But then it was like Jeff Hattersley, who grew up in the village next to me near Barnsley, and who was part of my kind of dad's generation, or kind of really unfashionable kind of movement poets like Philip Larkin and Tom Gunn, and then this great Penguin anthology called Children of Albion, which is this weird underground British beat poetry anthology that Penguin did in the 70s. And somehow I think if you pour all that in together and kind of mix it up, that's how you begin to kind of step into a voice that feels more your own. And that's what I'm always trying to encourage people to do, to read stuff they don't like, to read stuff they think they might not like, and to read as widely as possible, because then somehow bits of all of that come out in your own work.
Absolutely. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you as a result of that last question is, for me, having written poetry for probably 20 years, I find it as much of a burden as I do a joy, because it's almost as if every situation you come across in life, there's a small part of your mind which is crafting that situation into a poem. So for somebody like you, your third book is coming out in 2020, well, this year, in fact. It's been 6 years since your debut release. Do you have periods of time where you completely leave it alone, or consciously try and leave it alone? Or is it something which is a constant machine which is turning within your daily life?
I do try and leave it alone, but I do think that and there's no way to say this without sounding pretentious, I do think that on some level you have to inhabit the world as a poet in order for that kind of work to happen. I think, which doesn't mean I don't write every day, and I'm kind of suspicious of people that can, because I just can't. I kind of, not suspicious, I mean, I am envious of them. I'm kind of in awe of them. I try and do something connected to it every day, which is partly just through teaching or whatever, but kind of either reading student work or reading new collections of poetry or editing something. I try and be in that world every day, but I certainly don't write every day. I write quite slowly. And despite it being 3 books in 6 years, which does sound ridiculous, but now I'll stop after this one. I think that, I mean, I guess I've always thought about it like, if you were a dancer and you saw a bar fight, that you would somehow see it in choreography. And I think it's the same for poets. I don't think, I try and exist in the moment of my life. I try and not think, oh, this will make a good poem later. Because I think that would be a horrible way to live, and you'd be a weird person to be around. But I think that what I always wanted to do was just live my life and then somehow try and either redeem it or recollect it or make sense of it through the poetry later. And that's how I've always used it in both those books, and in this new one as well, to maybe just to live it and experience it as it's happening, and make all those mistakes and all those kind of hard, difficult things that happen to everybody, and then to try and go back to it and somehow polish it or redeem it through the poem, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you've spoken a little bit there about your writing process. I was wondering if you can either describe your writing space or all them sort of generic questions. If perhaps there's music you listen to, or you avoid them types of things.
I've got better at it. But I don't mean better at writing. I mean better at that writing process. So my process before, maybe when I first started out, was, I mean, I always write longhand. So I've got all my notebooks, and I've got them all saved in boxes. And I jokingly tell my boyfriend that it can be his pension. He doesn't realize they're kind of worthless, and he'll just have to throw them all out when I die. But they're all in boxes somewhere. And I used to write by kind of accumulation. So I would wait for a line or a phrase to come to me from wherever it is that they come from, and I'd write it down, and then I'd wait. And then 2 weeks later, another line would come, and I'd try and kind of fit it together. And it's an excruciatingly slow way to write. And just the more that I've done it, what I've been able to do is write much more in my head. And Helen, actually, you mentioned Helen Mort. Helen Mort talks really well about this idea of, I think she writes a lot when she runs or when she's out kind of walking. And for me, I've become much better at being able to kind of hold the idea in my brain rather than write it on paper, and just kind of walk around and turn it around and maybe begin to write a few lines so that it becomes formed in my head. And so when it comes time to get to the paper, I can almost just tip it out like a jug of water and get not a poem, but a first draft of something. And then it becomes easier to kind of play about with, I guess. So that's my process. And it tends to be trains, really. When I used to be on trains last year, trains really helped me for writing. I mean, I'm lucky enough, I've got this kind of study space at home, but it's for kind of admin and kind of work. I don't really write here. More now because of technology, like I might scribble little notes in my phone and stuff like that. But it's mainly just kind of sitting with the notebooks and just, I can draft much quicker than I used to be able to, but then it's going back and kind of editing it and reworking it. And that can take years, really.
I studied under a West Indian poet called R.K. Markham back in Sheffield, when lovely man. He's departed now, unfortunately, but I remember him telling me when I was doing my English degree and I just could not finish this poem, and he told me, don't worry about it, son. He said, 40 years I've been writing this poem and it's still not finished. And that really resonated with me, because I think it was Billy Collins who said, nobody's a good line machine. And the editing process when it comes to the poet is probably far more intense than it is with any other form of writing. So you talked about you have a kind of editorial team. Is it a person? Is it a group of people? Is it different people at different times? Or is it your dad? Does your dad take interest in editing your poems sometimes?
Never.
Or?
He probably would if I asked him. He's not refused to.
Yeah.
I think there'd be an awkwardness in some of the stuff he'd have to edit, I think. So he just looks at them when they're finished.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think it's interesting, that notion of that quote of no poet is a kind of good line machine. And I think what people forget is that sometimes lines of poems, as sentences in novels, just have to get you from A to B. That not every line of a poem can be full of really great imagery and kind of really sing, because then it's so loud and it kind of sinks. And there's that notion of like that old-fashioned notion of composing a poem. And I often think of that as like composing a piece of music. So where is the light and shade? Where's the rise and fall of it? Where's the loud moment, the crescendo of that really great image? But then where's that plain, quiet moment afterwards that allows the poet to sit and the reader, to sit and to rest? And I think that that's really important, to know that some parts of poem are just serving a very perfunctory purpose. They're just getting you kind of from A to B. I mean, in terms of editing, I've got friends that I kind of show the work to. So Sean Hewitt, who's a really good poet, has seen a lot of the bad first drafts of both those books. With this second one, the people that they're about, and so my partner, who features heavily in the first section of the new book, and then my sister as well, because I write about my nephew who died, they read those poems, and I just said to them, look, I'm not going to publish them if you're not happy with them. Let's talk about each of them. And they had that kind of editorial control, and that felt really important to me. And then at Jonathan Cape, I've got Robin Robertson. I'm incredibly lucky that the great poet Robin Robertson is my editor, and an incredibly engaged and kind of hands-on editor, kind of line by line, image by image, helping me kind of work through the stuff that no matter how many times you read it, somehow you've missed the fact you've used the same word 4 times accidentally in 2 lines or something. We just can't sometimes kind of grasp the mistakes that we've made or the things that we've done. And so having him there as a poet, as well as a kind of poet editor who's engaged in that world, feels really important. And he, with all the books, has been really integral in shaping them and kind of helping me get to grips with what they are. If they'd just have published the manuscript that I sent, it would have been terrible. Like there's about 18 pages that got took out. There were a lot of the kind of poems that people like were newer poems that I wrote that got put in. The kind of order shifted about, and he just had this overall, which you kind of don't have when you're in the mist and the forest of all those poems. This overall eye to say, well, actually, this is the arc of it, and this is how it should begin, and this is where it ends, and things like that. And that was really important for me. So I guess they're the sort of stages that it goes through.
Yeah, the editorial side is so important, isn't it? It's got to be somebody that you trust too, I guess.
Yeah. I think somebody that you trust and somebody who gets what you're trying to do, because there's very little point in someone kind of saying, well, I wouldn't write it like this. I think you should write it like that, because then they're kind of just rewriting your poem in their image. And I think it's important that it's someone who, oftentimes who doesn't want to write the same stuff you do. So someone who has a kind of different space and a different voice, but is able to I think, understand what it is you want to do and help you towards that. And someone like Robin, you know, Jonathan Cape, a really traditional publisher, they never had a conversation about whether I should put punctuation in those poems. They allowed me to kind of have no punctuation, have the breath space, have a lowercase title on the front cover. You know, things like that seem quite small, but actually were quite big asks of a kind of newbie poet who was kind of saying, well, this is aesthetically what I want for it. And so somebody who can step back and allow you to kind of make those decisions, I think, as well, is important. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with that work the longest. You know, after the publishers moved on to the next thing, and after the reviews have moved on, the prices have moved on, and the readership's moved on, and all that, you're left with your own books on your shelf. And you have to be happy with them. That's the most important thing beyond anything else. The kind of wheel of, certainly of trade publishing, turns incredibly quickly. And so it's always the next thing, the next book, the next thing they're going to promote. And so you have to be happy with it because it's on your shelf for life. And I think that's the thing I always try and bear in mind as well.
What do you think is the single most important piece of advice you've been given as a poet?
I think that there's a kind of non-obvious answer, and then there's a kind of clear answer that I have. And I think that something that I got that wasn't advice, but I feel is important to talk about, is obviously that my dad's a poet, and so I grew up in a house of poetry. And so what that meant was, it wasn't kind of direct advice. No one ever kind of advised me to be a poet. I've got two older sisters. They're not in this world at all. They look at it as something slightly odd, which of course it is. And but what it meant was that I saw it as something tangible. And so it wasn't necessarily advice, but a kind of inherent implicit permission that this was something that people did. And not just that this was something that people wrote, but this was something that people might do as a job. And this was actually something that someone might be. And so not necessarily advice, but in terms of a kind of just a permission to grow up in that kind of really odd, unique space of just being surrounded by poetry and have a tangible thing that one could look at and say, that is a poet. That was really important. The kind of, on a more solid level, the kind of advice that my editor gave me after Physical came out and did what it did, I had this real sense, for whatever reason, and no one had put it in my head but me, that the second book had to be radically different. I thought, that's it now, I've got to do something really different. And I flailed around for a long time. And at one point, I was going to write a sequence of historical sonnets about women. And I took them to my editor and he was like, no, maybe not. And they just didn't work and they were terrible because I didn't want to write them. I just thought that I should do something really different and write something that was really opposite to the first book. And he said this really interesting thing. He said to me, your work will change because you will change, but you have your sensibility and your way of looking at the world. And that, again, in terms of permission, was just really great because I suddenly thought, well, of course, the work will shift because I will shift and I'll grow up and I'll have different experiences, but I have that voice and my way of looking at the world. And so that was just really a really important permission, I think, for me in terms of kind of the work that then went into that second collection. And I really thought that the way I ended up thinking about that second book was if you didn't like the first one, you'll really hate the second one. And that turned out to be true.
We've got a brilliant poet laureate at the moment in Simon Armitage. Now, I don't intend this to be in any way, shape or form controversial, but I'm wondering whether you've got one eye on that job in the future.
Whatever I say now is going to be dragged out in 10 years, isn't it? I don't personally, and just because I'm a kind of Republican, I think you can do that job and be Republican probably. It's just not something that I'm kind of suited for. My worst nightmare is to be famous. And that for me, I thrive on a sense of like, there's a kind of poetry fame or something like that, but it's not real world fame. Like you walk down the street and nobody knows who you are. And I think that I like that anonymity and I like that kind of space. I think that what's been really interesting in the last, both with Motion and the Poetry Archive with Duffy and everything that she did, and now with Simon, is that the role has actually shifted. into being a kind of ambassador for poetry, or a kind of a kind of spokesperson for poetry. And I like the idea of that role. I think that that's an important role to have. I think that it's not me who should be doing it. But I will always fully support and be behind the people that do. And I think all the 3 laureates that we've had in my lifetime, while I've been kind of conscious of poetry after Hughes died, and when we got that term limit on it of 10 years, I think this shift into it being this kind of ambassadorial role for poetry, what can I use that position to do? Who else can I bring along? Who can I shine a light on? What causes? So environmentalism for Simon, what causes can I shine a light on? That feels to me really important. But I think there are probably people that are much better suited to it than I am. There we go. That's hedging my bets, isn't it?
It was honest but diplomatic and interesting all at once, I thought.
There we go. That's all I can hope to be.
So we were speaking then, weren't we, about the responsibility. So I mean, I can take this in a couple of directions, and I would like to touch on both of these things. They might not sort of roll into point, but I'm sure we'll cover them before we're done. I think the first and most pressing of them, how important do you think the idea of representation is in your work? So be that of an issue of gender or race or class or sexuality, do those considerations, do they weigh heavy on you when you're writing?
I've gone through a kind of journey with this. And so when I first started writing physical, and obviously then it began to be described as a kind of queer collection or a kind of gay collection, it struck me that I'd only ever, I was writing from myself and I'd only ever fallen in love with men or been with men. And so to me, that was the obvious thing that I would write about. And so in that sense, it was never a kind of political decision. It just seemed to me to be a kind of obvious decision if I was going to write about my own life. And similarly, with notions of a kind of Barnsley kind of dialect that's in there sometimes, or certainly kind of grammar structure that some of the reviewers picked up on, that again wasn't deliberate. That was just what I thought the syntax was, and that kind of often got pulled apart in reviews. And I think so for me, initially, it wasn't necessarily there was never a conscious decision. It just felt that they were the obvious things, having grown up where I grew up and having kind of lived the life that I lived, that those would be the things that I would write about. I think as I've gone through, and now that I have a kind of bigger platform, and now that I'm kind of invited to do a lot of events, it strikes me that actually not having to think of or not seeing those identities necessarily as political at first, and so not necessarily around class, but around northernness, I think, certainly, or kind of regionalism and around sexuality as well, that to not see them as front and center in oneself comes from a position of privilege and comes from a kind of, an inherent safety of me with all the kind of different layers of privilege that I might have aside from kind of sexuality and things like that. And so the more that I've gone through, not articulating this that well, but I guess the more that I've gone through, I've realized the importance of a label like queer or of gay and of kind of speaking up for the North as well, and of kind of using that platform to hopefully kind of be able to speak up about things like that. And also hopefully then the work just gives permission for new generations to come through and kind of find their own space in poetry, and certainly in terms of queer poetry, the explosion of queer poetry in the last few years and spaces for it and books published and things like that has been quite amazing. And I think, representation on a broad sense is incredibly important. So if you don't see yourself, how can you be yourself? We were at school, I assume we're all about the same age. We all went to school during Section 28, which was rescinded in 2003. So when I was in year 9 of school. And so before that, and I talk about this a little bit in playtime, but I just didn't, it wasn't that I thought I was gay and I was scared about it. I just didn't know what that word meant or what it was or what that would even be, because no one had ever given me a language for it. I kind of knew I wasn't like the other boys, but I didn't know what that meant or what that would be or anything like that. And so, because, we were never taught it in school, it was never mentioned. And so I think that in terms of and representations on television were of a very certain sort and not kind of diverse or pluralistic. And I think that in all art, people need to see themselves represented in order to be able to grow into themselves properly. And that was never an agenda of the work. The agenda of the kind of work, if it had an agenda, was always just to be true to the self and to write the self and just kind of put that truth onto the page. But I think that kind of work, then the importance of it comes in terms of who finds himself in it or who takes permission in it, maybe.
I think you've made some really pertinent points there. I'm undertaking my MA at the moment, and a lot of my research is about masculinity and representations of masculinity within comedy and within the sitcom, which has sort of been dismissed because it's almost low status. But because it has such mass audience and great appeal, you can't avoid its importance, and it ought to be a genuinely serious academic concern as a result. But if we follow that sort of those comments that you made about your sexuality, I mean, I read recently that you came out at 16, which is quite young, and
It's quite young, isn't it?
It's really sort of personal to me at the moment, because just before Christmas, my son, who turned 16 only a week or so ago, came out as bi. And at the same time, my daughter, who's 10 months younger, she came out as pansexual. So, which it's great that we sort of fostered that environment where they're happy to come out young. But I asked you earlier about whether the considerations of representation weigh heavy on you as a writer. If we follow that by asking, do you think that you have a responsibility as an out man with your position of influence, perhaps?
I mean, I guess I do, and that's never something that I've sought or wanted, and they're much better spokespeople for this community than me. I mean, it's interesting, talking about your children there, how much better that generation is with at understanding language, at being accepting of each other, at kind of having a wider vocabulary to talk about who they feel they are, and kind of and who they are and who they love and who they want to be. They have such a wide vocabulary at their disposal that I never kind of felt I had. I mean, I think that, I mean, less so in university, because it's quite unshocking, I think, to be a kind of out gay lecturer, that kind of part of the course, especially in a big city. That feels kind of unshockable, unsurprising to a certain extent. I think that when I was doing a lot more kind of schools work, and when I was kind of working maybe with young offenders and things like that, when I was kind of freelance, it felt important to, that it wasn't necessarily that that's what I led with, but I was always kind of authentically myself. And that always felt important to be, just to be kind of visibly out, I guess, and proud of that, and to be able to write and to want to write about that and things like that. But I think there are, there are much kind of better, more articulate, more politically engaged spokespeople for things like that than me. But I think that that it's important to be visible and to speak about who you are and where you're from has been important as well. It was interesting when Physical came out. I mean, I've talked about this before, but I got asked to do a lot of pieces that were kind of like, we write about how grim it must have been growing up gay in Barnsley, and then kind of how books saved you, or something like that would be the kind of narrative or whatever. And I kind of had to say to them, well, I'll write that piece. And I did. I wrote them for The Independent about like books that made me. But I said, like, I had such a wonderful kind of, and it wasn't kind of plain sailing because it isn't for anyone, but I had a very kind of accepting coming out. As you said, I came out at 16. I was lucky enough that I came out into a kind of liberal family who accepted that, and who were kind of okay with that. And then it was almost this kind of very innocent time, because it was before apps and it was before most of the internet, somehow it seemed to me. And so at 16 and 17, there was kind of quite a big group of us, a kind of extended friendship group, who would go out to the once a week gay night in Barnsley at the Chicago Rock Cafe and just kind of make mistakes and kiss each other and get drunk and fall out and just have fun in this way that seems now incredibly innocent. And I think that, I mean, one of my worries around particularly young men, I think, is that with a lack of sex education in schools, you abandon an entire generation of young men just to pornography and the internet. And that is so destructive to that. And I'm not anti-porn at all. You know, I've written about porn in the points, but I think it's so destructive without a proper kind of rounded personal health and social education structure in schools. We're failing everybody, and we're particularly failing trans kids and queer kids who need to see themselves validated in the language that they get in the schools, and they need to feel accepted. And that is interesting because that generation of kids together as a group, as a generation, are so kind of further on than us and above, and our generations above us in terms of the language, in terms of the acceptance. And I think that there's a lot that they could teach us. But yeah, to go back to that initial question, I guess there is a responsibility in it. And I try to not, you know, more and more, I try not to take that lightly, I think.
You're going to have somebody sat in your lecture theatre, in your seminar groups, who is going to be the next Andrew McMillan or the next Carol Ann Duffy or the next Helen Moore, for example. How important is it for you to be that person that not only fosters that talent, but inspires them to understand that there is a living to be made from this? There is such a thing as a poet, as a job.
I think it's lovely if I can do that. And part of what I've always wanted to do, so from being freelance into kind of working in academia, is to kind of really pay forward, as I said earlier, that thing that I got for free at home, which was that knowing that it could be a job and knowing that it kind of was possible. And I think that certainly what I never wanted to do, and never wanted to be guilty of, was pulling up the ladder behind me, given all the kind of advantages that I'd already had. And I think that if you are lucky enough, and it is mainly luck, to get any kind of position like that, and not, you know, so not a kind of academic position in university, but a position kind of within that culture, within that kind of framework of poetry, your job is to just be endlessly encouraging to as many people as possible, and to try and help them out and offer advice, and be kind and be generous with your time, because, you know, as much as we can, because it seems to me that that's what people did for me when they had no cause to. And that's what I kind of want to do. And I try and do my best. Like, a lot of the time, if I get asked to blurb something, I just physically don't have the time, but I try and do my best for people, and I try and kind of shout about stuff on Twitter. That's what I use my Twitter mainly for. Now it seems to me it's evolved into just me photographing books and saying, read this. And I quite like kind of doing that. I mean, in universities, I just think it's incredibly important that students are presented with, particularly in creative writing, we have this real opportunity because we're not bound by a kind of so-called literary canon, and we don't have to teach kind of canonical literature in creative writing. Of course, that's important for them to learn from poets of the past, but we have this incredible opportunity that we can, and what I do is focus on kind of hyper-contemporary work. And so we have this real opportunity and this real, I think, imperative to put in front of students diverse, interesting, contemporary poetry, so that they can find their own pathway through it. And what I'm really proud about MMU is that there's not necessarily a kind of house style, but we kind of help people find their own pathway through things. And I think just showing people that diverse range of contemporary poetry and putting that in front of them, that hopefully is inspiring. So it's not that they should want to be me, God forbid, but that they should want to be like the poets that we put in front of them. I think that that's really important. I mean, I used to be able to kid myself that I was as young as the students I'm teaching, and that, alas, is no longer the case.
That's faded for all of us. We're all teachers, actually. Yeah, so we understand that very much.
There was this one moment where, my office was at one end of Oxford Road, and the classroom that I taught in was at the other. And on Freshers' Week, there would always be people standing there handing out free dominoes. Like, that was just what they gave out on Freshers' Week. And so for the first 2 or 3 years when I was in Manchester, I would always get given one. And then they just passed this moment where they were like, no, he's clearly not. And there was just a moment where I was like, oh, okay, I've crossed the threshold into a lecturer. But I mean, it's an incredible privilege to be able to do. And I love teaching. I love being freelance. I love the community work. I'm just not built for it. It made me far too anxious. I'm far too bad with money. It was a disaster tax-wise and things like that. Like I was very bad at it. So just for me, in terms of like anxiety and in terms of just my own lifestyle, I needed something more secure to be able to relax. But I love that I get to talk about poetry every day at different levels, and it just keeps me engaged with it. So it means that I have to keep reading. I have to read what new students are writing. I have to read what's come out this year so I can teach it. And so you have to stay engaged with it. And I think that that is made, since I started lecturing, whenever that was, years ago, it's made me a much better poet. It made me take it more seriously. And that's then what you hope to give to the students, I think.
You published your debut collection in 2015. Can you describe the feeling to me? Because I'm sure you did this. Most writers do this. Can you describe the feeling when you first went into a bookshop, whether it be Waterstones or an independent bookshop, and saw your name on the shelf amongst all those great names? What was that feeling, and how would you describe it to somebody who aspires to that one day?
It's something that you never quite get over. And so, I mean, I remember two things. I remember I'd sent off the manuscript kind of to the slush pile of Cape and just thought, well, I've tried that, and then, you know, I'll move on and I'll do something else. And then I got an email from Robin Robertson that said, can I call you? And that's all it said. And I thought, oh God, he wants to let me down gently. That's fine. He can call me and let me down gently. And I was at work. I was in my office at work, and he called me and sort of said, right, there's a lot of work we need to do on it. There's this and that, but let's do it. Let's take it on. And so I tried to kind of remain calm on the phone. And then I remember I kind of ran down the corridor to find an empty classroom and just went into the empty classroom and screamed. And then just went back to my office and had to kind of get on with my work. And then I called my mum to tell her, and she said, can you call me back? Your auntie's just getting in the car. And then, so then I called my dad.
Priorities.
So I had to like leave him a voicemail. And I was like, I just want to tell somebody this news. But then I did a gig. The book came out in like July, I think it was, in 2015. And I did a gig in May, kind of before the book had come out. And I walked in and they had it on the book table. And I'd not been expecting to see it because I'd not been sent any copies. I'd not seen it yet, but they had it on the book table. It's just this astonishing thing, just to kind of weigh in your hand. And because it's poetry, it's always quite slim, but it felt like this kind of, it's a lifetime that had built up to it. And it's not something that I ever thought I would kind of have. And just the cover that they chose for it and things like that is this magical thing. And I always still, I know this makes me quite sad, but I think everyone does it, so it's okay. I will always, in any bookshop, go and see if they have it. And then if they don't have it, I assume they've sold out through popularity. But then if they do have it, it's always just this little thrill. And I've always kept, physical was translated quite a bit. I've always kept all the covers of all the kind of different versions of it and all the books. And it feels to me, like I say, like I think that I don't have any ambition for the work to be remembered by anyone else, but I like this idea that sort of in 40 or 50 years, my grandkids come or something like that, and I get this old box out and I go, look, I used to do this. This sense of like, there's something so, poetry can often feel quite ephemeral, and it can feel like quite a solo thing to do. And there's something just so tangible and concrete about that book or about that pamphlet or about that kind of recording of something, that kind of physical thing that just grounds it. And it's just an amazing thing. It really is. And, it never goes away. It always feels like that, I think, every single time. There's, seeing your name in a magazine. I always, when I'm in magazines, or when I used to be in magazines more, I would always buy the magazine and then look where I was next to. And I just always used to think, oh, I bet they've read my poem. And I remember once in an issue of The North, like when I was first starting out, I was in The North, and I think Simon Armitage was on the page next to me. And I just thought, oh God, I bet that means Simon's read my poem. Because we know most poets just flick to the page they're on, right, and look at that first. So I kind of thought, oh wow, so maybe Simon's kind of seen that poem. And something about just kind of being, that's still what I love to do as well, kind of getting in and think, ooh, who am I next to? Who's read this? Which I know is juvenile, but it thrills me still.
And it should do. So, Andrew, thank you very much for your time. We'd like to say a real big thank you on behalf of myself and Alan and all at the Broken Spine Artist Collective. we'd love to send you over a few copies for you to peruse. And we wish you all the very best with Pandemonium coming out this year. We'll certainly be buying it. It'll be joining the other 2 books on our shelf. And it would be wonderful to maybe look at working with you in the future with your students, maybe to do a print issue. And it's also wonderful that people that do have your platform are willing to give away your time to people like us to speak about your work. So we have to say thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Oh, anytime. And yeah, let's have that conversation. Drop me an email and let's have that chat about ways we can work together.
Brilliant.
Definitely.